Hello and welcome to this episode of the Health Tech Marketing Show. Really excited today. I've got one of my colleagues and we're going to talk about webinars. So first of all, thank you to you for listening and for watching, however you're consuming today's show. And also a big thank you to my colleagues at HIMSS for sponsoring this along with my firm, Health Launchpad. Anyway, so today we're going to talk about virtual, we're going to talk about webinars, and that's going to be the kind of key focus. It's always one of those issues, right, where is this the year that webinars are dying? Is this the year that webinars are coming back? I frankly think they're a tried and trusted method of marketing. And to help me with this, I am bringing along one of my awesome colleagues, the terrific Hannah Drake Kelley. Hannah, welcome to the show. It's great to have you on.
Happy to be here.
Oh, brilliant. Hannah is one of my colleagues, and she'll tell you a little bit about background. This is somebody who has used webinars in the shoes of a marketer, not just as an agency person, but in the shoes of a marketer to drive business for companies that she's worked for. So Hannah, tell us a little bit about yourself, and then let's hear about best practice in webinars.
Sure. So I'm Hannah, as you guys have heard already. And this is actually partnering with Adam is actually my first time being on the agency side. So prior to now, I was always on the brand side. So just before this, I obviously have a background in health tech. I worked for a smaller startup and helped launch several products. And a big part of our go-to-market and demand gen program was webinars. It was just one piece, of course. Obviously, anyone who's listening most likely knows there's no single silver bullet to marketing. And then prior to that, I was in biotech. The most recent company I worked for, one of the products was so successful that it was acquired. So I helped lead an integration post-acquisition. And then I decided I wanted to go find other smaller companies to help build. And then Adam found me. So here I am.
Yeah, it's been a year and it's just great having you to collaborate with.
Yeah,
cool.
No,
So, let's talk about webinars.
Let's do it. Okay, so I guess how do you want
to forgot to mention this beforehand. Yeah, if you're watching the video, you're seeing a presentation. If you're listening to the podcast, you obviously won't see the presentation. Hannah's going to go through this in a way that you don't necessarily need to see the slides. But if you'd like to see the slides, you can download it in the show notes, or if you're watching on the video, you can download it in the YouTube blurb about this episode. There's no registration required. Please just have at it. We're not gating this content. So sorry about that, Hannah. I should have done that housekeeping up front. There you go. Best practice webinars. Be better prepared.
Yes, B2B webinars that work. So I guess when we talk about what works and the concept of what good looks like, the first thing that I like to consider is what doesn't work, because a big part of knowing what success is also defining what success isn't. And a lot of times in many conversations about things, I think people either forget to address that part, but it's a really good way to box in what you're aiming for and what you're not aiming for. So the first thing I want to talk about is actually what doesn't work. But before we go into that, let's give a brief overview of kind of the topics that I think, and this is going to be a crash course in webinars of everything I know, but there's a lot more to know than what we'll talk about here. So we'll start with why webinars work, what results you should expect to achieve. And again, we're talking about B2B here, how to select the right topic, how to design an event that will attract the right audience, when to schedule a webinar, and how to promote it. And then also we'll talk a little bit about follow-up. Okay, so why webinars? There's so many things that we can do in marketing, especially in the digital age. There's so many choices to make from a budget perspective. Why should webinars be a part of any go-to-market or demand gen or lead nurture strategy? What I find is that executives tend to shy away from webinars depending on the size of their team because they are resource intensive when done well. And there's a few options here. You can either, if you have the chops internally, you can run them in-house. If you don't, then there's going to be several media partners that will package these up and offer them to you, normally at a fairly high price ticket. You're looking about the size of a larger conference to do a hosted one with a well-known media partner. But the reason that webinars work so well, and the reason that they can put these types of price tickets on webinars, is because unlike even in-person events, webinars have a scalability aspect. So they're a great alternative to in-person events, and the on-demand nature and the ability to continually pull out any great nuggets for, you've got the time and the team to do so, you can get so much traction out of a webinar. You can also access hundreds of people simultaneously, no matter where they are geographically. So it's much easier to convince a prospect to sign online for an hour than it is to make sure that they happen to be on the same side of the coast as you, and they're going to the same conference, and they're also going to go to the same presentation or visit your booth at the right time. There's a lot of variables there, and you're competing for a lot of attention with that. The second thing is trust, right? Give the business a human face. So when you're comparing whether to do a webinar with content syndication or email marketing or what have you, one of the nice things about webinars is they start to personalize your offering, which helps build brand trust during the sales cycle. Because at the end of the day, people still buy from people. Yes, it's a B2B transaction. Yes, it could be an enterprise sale, but there's still a human connection where they want to know, do I trust on some subconscious level, sometimes conscious, the people that are driving this company, this product, this service, this business that I'm about to invest in? And then lastly, as far as the leads, webinars are consistently a top source of B2B qualified leads. So some quick stats on this: 73% of B2B marketers consider webinars as the best way to generate qualified leads. So there's always this conversation in the tech marketing space as, is it quantity or quality? And there's going to be a tension there, especially when you are measured against KPIs, right? Because if you need to generate 500 leads, you can do that. But what really matters as far as revenue is the quality of those leads and their sales readiness. Which brings me to my next stat. 20 to 40% of webinar leads will turn into qualified leads at some point. And these are metrics, and we're all marketers here. So since we're among friends, we know that metrics typically, if you're really going to dig into them, you don't really know if all of them are completely trustworthy. I will say from my personal experience that these stats do align with what I learned during my tenure of doing it on the brand side and running successful webinars. Next point, 2 to 5% of webinar leads will engage with sales after a webinar. Again, this is on par with what I saw. It's always a nice surprise because you never know, but there's always that little excitement as a marketer when you get the hand raised for, yeah, have someone from sales contact me. And then from an overall perspective, not time boxed, 15% of attendees to a webinar will purchase at some point overall. So if webinars are not a plan or are not a part of your marketing plan, they need to be. And we don't have a ton of time today, but there's a lot I could say about hosting internally versus externally. But there's so much more value if you can do it internally because you've got so much more control over nurturing those leads and everything else. So
I think these stats are so interesting. I think the sort of the 2 to 5% that engage after sales. So you can't, sometimes you hear some companies say, oh, it's so frustrating, only 2 or 5. We've got 100 people to register, and 40 people showed up, and we've only got 5 calls out of it. I think the bigger point is your 20 to 40% will turn into qualified leads eventually. And that's, I think, the point is particularly with long sales cycles, is that you're contributing to the long-term pipeline. It's not just about the results directly after the webinar.
Yes, that's completely accurate. And ideal state, this is not a one-shot marketing attempt. It's a part of your yearly planning. At minimum, I would recommend 1 per quarter, depending on your size. If you can do more than that, great. It really depends on your bandwidth. And then obviously the market you're in, your product, and how complicated it is and how much value you can add with the webinar. So to the point that you just touched on, one of the things people want to know, especially from a revenue and numbers perspective, is, okay, if I'm doing a webinar, how many registrations am I going to get? And what does good actually look like for a live webinar? Once you have some chops, I think my all-time high was 450 registrations and like 200 live attendees. Yeah, which is really big for a B2B in-house webinar. The average number is 260 registrations, but something to keep in mind here is that many prospects will register because they're interested in the topic, but they know ahead of time that they won't be able to make that time. So they're planning on their recording. If you're new to webinars, expect around a 40% attendance rate live. So for the 260, it'd be about 100 to 110. But there's ways that you can drive
I've seen it do with lots of webinars that I've done. A lot of the webinars I've done with HIMSS, for example, that's fairly standard. Yeah, so absolutely great.
Yeah. So I'd say if you're looking for a baseline, that's a good place to start. Of course, it also depends on if you're doing it internally, it's a lot going to depend on how wide your reach is when you're promoting it, right? Because if you have an email list of 2,000, that changes things a lot. That's your total addressable market as far as getting people into the webinar. And the next stat on this slide, if you're viewing it, says 35%. And this is another key stat that always surprised me, but it's one of my personal favorites because I just think it's wild. 35% are the number of attendees who sign up 1 to 7 days before the webinar. Now, get this though, 29% register the day of the event or the day before.
That's amazing. Yeah. That's interesting.
Yeah. The funny thing is, I went to I was at one of HubSpot's annual shows, and I think GoToWebinar was presenting, and they gave some really cool stats on what things look like, right? And they're one of the heavyweights in the hosting industry for webinars, or definitely were at the time. And they were telling us that registrations are in a reverse bell curve. So you've got two sectors of people. You've got the people that are the completely advanced planners. And I bet if you think about who's in your personal life, people naturally fall into this, right? They're either the all-star like operations, like they're planning your vacation down to what are you doing at 10 o'clock and 12 o'clock and 3 o'clock that day when you go on vacation. Those are the people that are going to register 6 weeks out. It's going to be 6 to 8 weeks. So what GoToWebinar had recommended at the time was that you start promotions at a minimum 6 to 8 weeks out. Now that is a little bit of a reach during as far as the speed of how people want webinars to go, but keep it in mind as nice to have. Yeah. But every single webinar that I was involved in, sometimes if you're working with larger teams, there's going to be pushback on doing an additional email marketing push the day of and the day before, because they're like, we already sent so many emails. But I guarantee you that email will have the most registrations every time. And we actually, at Health Launchpad, we gave the same advice to one of our clients, and they were blown away. They were absolutely blown away. They were like, it was our best attended webinar. Our sales team was so happy. And it was one of those moments where you just never get tired of doing it.
Hey, I want to put your spot, actually. I'm going to ask you a question about attendees versus registrants. Any sense, and this may be more gut feel than empirical data, on whether people who attend are more likely to become a qualified lead versus just register regular don't attend?
It's an interesting question. I really think it depends on their title level, honestly, because their title level and probably their brand exposure so far, right? Because if I'm a busy director, VP, something like that, and I'm somewhat interested, my calendar is going to be busy. That's the reality.
Yep.
I'll register and maybe have intentions of going and then can't go. That doesn't mean I won't engage later. At the same time, if I'm someone who's, to use a colloquialism or something, lower down the totem pole and I have a less busy schedule, I'm probably more likely to attend. So I think there's not really a super clear delineation there. I think what a better gauge of if they're live, and even if they're not live, how to tell that you've got an additional or some more warmth there is one, if you're doing pre-registration questions, if they're interested, they'll actually ask specific questions in the "do you have any other questions for us" box ahead of time. If they're engaging and asking questions live in the chat box, that's always obviously a good sign. And if they can't engage live, the people that were warmer and did eventually become clients, and this isn't to say that this is exclusively that, but they would reply to the email, the marketing emails, and actually ask questions or ask for the slide deck or something like that. So there's signals that you can look for, but again, that's not going to be everybody.
That's a great insight. I love that. So the point is, look at the titles, and that notion of the pre-registration, really smart, because that's actually a way to see how engaged, how really interested is the attendee.
Yeah.
Okay.
The other thing to scan for, since we're talking about looking at pre-registrations, is depending on what the topic is of your webinar, it's worthwhile scanning and watching the registrations, because B2B tech is competitive, and there's definitely going to be people that will try to sneak in under personal emails or something to that effect, and sometimes perhaps you just don't want them there. Usually, I think brands are pretty good about, if something's going to be in a webinar, it's probably going to get out. So we shouldn't say something that we don't want competitors to know. But at the same time, maybe you don't want a live competitor there. There was something funny where we were, and actually speaking of driving live attendance, one of my favorite tricks we'll talk about later is, or not tricks, it's fine, you run a live raffle. So we were running a live raffle, and we did scrub the pre-registration list, but somebody got in on a consulting email, right? But they were actually a competitor. They just happened to also be a consultant, and our competitor won the raffle. That was funny. We still gave it to them because it's a small industry.
Exactly. You never know, right?
All right. So let's transition a little bit to what doesn't work, right? So I started talking about earlier, thinking about how to create those boundaries. So the big things are, and none of these will really be a surprise if you think about it, failing to plan, right? And so all of these items are really what leads to webinars with poor ratings at the end. Failing to plan can create a disaster of a live webinar. Webinars that fake themselves as being educational and then are really just thinly guised product or solution focused webinars. As a consumer, people understand that, yes, you're trying to sell a product, but at the same time, don't label something and position it as an educational thing and then spend 80% of the time talking about your product, which is exactly the next bullet: misleading titles that lead to product or solution focused webinars. Weak promotional plans. So you could have a amazing webinar, and if you don't put the time in to promote it, you could have the best message in the world. If you're in the middle of the forest yelling it out, it's not going to have any impact. So it's not only taking the time to really have a strong content offering within your webinar, it's also putting that equal effort into executing and planning the promotion ahead of time, whether that's internal only, whether you're going to do a list rental with one of your media partners if you're not hosting it third party, whether you're going to do advertising on LinkedIn, that kind of stuff. So you want to think about marketing to your webinar, which is a marketing tool, as part of the funnel. And then the other big thing, and this is a big one, is failing to engage the sales team. So one of the things I see, especially as companies get larger, is you get this bigger and bigger gap between sales and marketing. Mm-hmm. And with smaller teams, one of the things I like about smaller teams is you can be extremely agile. So it's, if you're running a webinar, you're talking to your sales team, the BDRs, hey guys, when you make your calls, if they're not ready to meet directly for a sales pitch, invite them to our webinar. So that's another tip, right? Is your sales team can use webinars just as much as they can if people aren't ready for, let's go on a date with the sales team, right? If they want to learn more, they're engaged enough, but they're still not quite ready to engage at that level that's further down the funnel. Floating it back up a level and asking them to attend the webinar is something that's a much easier yes for a prospect. And psychologically, people like to say yes to things. If your cold callers or BDRs or what have you are having a tough time getting a yes to a sales meeting, they're much more likely to say yes to attending a webinar, which might create the yes to the sales meeting.
Yep.
You definitely need to engage the sales team ahead of time. It's not just the list at the end and here you go.
It's very true. It's almost thinking about it the way that you would with a live event, which is preparing and trying to figure out. But actually, you have, as opposed to a live event where you might, if you paid for the sponsorship, get a list of who the attendees are. This, you actually do have a list of who's registered. So it's even more important. I love that point.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's a great point. And I think this is a great part to transition to what does work and what's required in planning a webinar. So I gave very brief airtime to it just now, but the single most important thing is the content of the webinar. Now, when you think about it on a very basic human to human level, it's a value exchange, right? And that's such a basic marketing concept, but it's so easily forgotten at the same time, right? Because people get caught in numbers and attendees and KPIs and goals and having to deliver on XYZ. But it's so worth it thinking and collaborating and having a brainstorm session on what do we talk about and how do we offer value to position ourselves as a thought leader in the space. And then beyond just who are internal SMEs that could come, right? Beyond that, the best thing that you could possibly do is if you can obviously get a customer or a client to talk with you about their experience, that will be your best webinar by far. People love hearing from other clients, especially in a live forum. And then if not that, do any of your tech partners or partners in the space or individual thought leaders, quote unquote, B2B influencers, if you will, people that can be seen as a somewhat neutral because they are on your webinar third party, because there's an inherent distrust when the brand is talking about the brand. But people always want to be able to stay knowledgeable about their job. So this is where it comes into like the buyer journeys and the persona work and stuff like that. When planning a webinar title and content, the best advice I can give is think about who you're trying to get to come and what matters to them and what's going to help them do their job better. And if you can tie your product into some topic that has to do with that, they're going to show up because they're going to get value. And the thing that happens then is even if they're not sales ready at that point, they start to associate your brand with something positive that's offering value to them in their job. So you've created this positive relationship of sorts, right? Or a distant relationship. But that also means that they start to have this brand awareness and association with what you do offer. So whether it's at the company they're at now, when they are in market, that type of thing, they've already got a positive association with your brand and your offering. So even if it's not a sales ready lead at that point in time, offering value is 1,000% the way to go with when you're selecting your topic.
Excellent. Yeah. I think it's such an important point that it is all about the content, right? And I do think that many marketers lose track of that and think that it is actually about us and focus too much on promoting their products and not on the exchange as you talk about it. Yeah.
Yeah. Now that said, you can't. It'd be great if you could just have a webinar for the sake of educating people. At the end of the day, people are in this to make money. So of course you need to talk about the products, but try to limit it so that, or at least this is what I like to do. I'm sure there's other opinions out there. Try to limit it so that maybe the sales person, whoever that is, gets 5 to 10 minutes to give airtime to who you are, what you offer, etc. So that's at least out there. And then extend the invitation if they need to learn more. And then most likely the content of the webinar is probably also going to weave in and out of talking about things that your product or solution does. The other type that does really well, although it's the most intensive from a planning perspective, is the panel conversation style webinar with multiple partners and experts. Yeah, so they do really well and they probably have the most value from a extended time perspective. But the planning for that definitely requires much more attention because now you're combining multiple schedules. You have to do dry runs and so on and so forth. Make sure everyone's comfortable with the tech to do it really well. And this comes back to planning, but all of those things can be done. It's just things to consider when you are starting to decide what you're going to do.
I love doing panels and moderating them. Not really being on them is great too, but I really do love running panels. And I've actually found that the best response, usually the best registrations and the highest participation has been with the panels. Have you found that, or is that maybe just maybe just my own personal experience?
I think from my experience, the panel ones are well attended, but they're not the best for audience engagement because I think there's a part of people that wants to let the experts speak. I find that there's more audience engagement when there's a single external expert or something like that.
Interesting. Okay, that's interesting. I can see that. Yeah.
Yeah, they're both great ones to do, but both of those types are the more intensive. Obviously, the least intensive is from a internal production point of view, is going to be the internal SME.
Yeah.
And then if you do an external hosted, they'll take care of a lot of things for you, but there's some quality control aspects that you're not going to have, and you're not going to be able, in most cases, you won't see the registration list until like pretty soon before the webinar, which is definitely frustrating for a marketer, especially when you want to know how it's doing.
If you believe in the value of webinars, learn how to do it yourself. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And then to that same point, when it comes to promoting the webinar, whether you're doing email marketing, that kind of thing, the other thing is you go to basic marketing of the webinar, right? When you're describing the webinar, keep it value prop focused to your target audience. So what are they going to get out of it? At the end of the day, people want to know what's in it for me. So keep that lens on it when you're describing it, not just hear from all these great people, which if you do have amazing, titled, knowledgeable, recognized people, then of course that will lead by itself. But sometimes you need more than just to talk about the topic.
Whenever I promoted a webinar, I always say, this is what you're going to learn. And I have that sort of 4 or 5 bullet points.
Yeah.
And that sort of, and because that also is particularly your point. If you're doing a panel, it keeps it honest. We're not going to go off in 65 different tangents. We're going to keep the audience, keep the panelists focused on these particular topics.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. That type of positioning is great. It's answering the question of like, why should I come? Why should I trade my time for this? So if they have a very clear what I'll get out of this, what I'll learn more about, then that's a reason for signing up.
Yeah. Let's get into the logistics of it, timing, practice rehearsals, and all that.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, going back to that fateful GoToWebinar HubSpot presentation I went to, they gave some stats on webinar timing. And even from that day to this day, it really hasn't shifted. I already mentioned begin planning 6 weeks out. Your best days for webinars are going to be Tuesday, Wednesday, or Thursday. Wednesday or Thursday have a slight edge over Tuesdays. If you are US based, you want to time your webinar somewhere between 1 EST to 3 EST, which is then 10 PST or to 12 PST. Yeah. This way, and again, that drives towards live attendance. So if your goal is to drive live attendance, which most people that are doing webinars want live attendance, those are your sweet spots. The other thing that's interesting and that I do get pushback on, because it feels like a lot, is that 90-minute webinars consistently do better attendance and registration-wise than 60-minute and really? 30. Yes.
Interesting. That really surprises me. Say more about that. Yeah.
Yes. So it's wild. And I understand and have experienced all the pushback on doing it because there's this ick factor, especially internally, like 90 minutes. What are we going to talk about for 90 minutes? Yeah. But that's exactly the reason that they do better, because the assumption by someone looking at a webinar and seeing it's 90 minutes long is like, oh, this is going to be really beefy. This is really a deep dive. Yeah. And so if they're interested in being educated, which hopefully you're using an educational topic, that's why 90-minute webinars consistently do better than 30, 45, and 60-minute webinars, which is wild to me because it is more time. But the assumption is you have a lot more to say, it's beefier, and they'll get more out of it.
Interesting. And you get more registrations and more attendance that way?
Yeah, it's a better quality of registration.
That's fascinating. That's great. That's a very actionable thing for anybody listening or watching this, is try 90-minute webinars. I know it is counterintuitive because I find that my natural instincts go the other way, go 30.
Yeah. And that's what everyone wants to do, is go to the shorter webinars, because the assumption is, oh, if it's shorter, more people will say yes. But actually, when people are committing, when they see it's 90 minutes, there's a different mental process. Think about, even if you get a 90-minute meeting invite at work, right? It's a different mental process than, oh, quick 15, quick 30. You're more committed when you sign up for that. So
yeah, it's interesting. I attended it was a summit, but it was like a 2-hour summit, which I thought was an interesting format, run by GTM partners last week. And it was 4 30-minute panels, or 4 30-minute presentations and panels. And I thought, and actually to that point that block stayed on my calendar. And although other stuff got inserted in it, I actually made the effort to attend nearly all of it. So that's very interesting.
Yeah, there's some interesting psychological switches that happen there. But
So,
from a planning perspective, yeah, it can be a little bit of a bear. So
preparation, right? That's the name. That's critical. Yeah.
yes. So no matter how expert you think you are, if you are using new tech, no matter how well acclaimed it is, you'll need at least one test and practice to check the audio and visual, the tech controls, the pacing, because I guarantee you there will be something that trips people up. And if it's new, you probably want to plan for 2 tech rehearsals. When I say, okay, let me get a little bit more specific here. You at least want one kind of tech focused. We're seeing what everything looks like. And when we do that, we need obviously the person who's running the webinar. Now, this is one of my other best practices. One of the things about webinars in creating the perception, because perception is reality, right? That it's professional, is that you want to have a designated moderator and then your SMEs and so on and so forth, even if it's internal, right? So you can introduce your SME. And of course, they're more than capable of doing the whole thing themselves. But there's something about somebody else introducing, handing off. And then also there's a very helpful aspect of they can watch the live chat. They can interrupt and run the live questions to the SME instead of the SME having to run slides, try to use this program that they may or may not know how to use, and all of those things. So you've got 2 kind of key goals with these pre-event rehearsals, right? One is making sure everyone's familiar with their view of the tech. So the moderator is going to have a different view and controls than the speaker, who's going to have a different view and controls than an audience member. So I always recommend that for a real, dress rehearsal, you've got everyone there, including pulling a buddy from work to be a fake attendee so that they can take screenshots, show you what it looks like so that you know what your attendees are going to experience, and also clarify that everything's running the way it's supposed to on their end. Same thing for a live webinar. Always have someone from the organization who's there as an attendee so they can confirm to you that everything's running live. And then the second goal is the content and pacing, right? So if it's a panel conversation, then there's a little kind of less work here. But even with that, because it is supposed to be more conversational in those, even with that, the ones that I've run and been a part of, when we did a pacing before, where it's not them fully talking about each of the questions and talking points, just to talk about this, it helps them get ready. And it also actually increases the camaraderie between the people on the panel. So this is really interesting because what happens at the live version of the panel is now they've got this comfort level with each other. And one of the things about all types of media is that people want to be entertained, right? So one of the mistakes in B2B webinars is that you've got these brilliant SMEs and it's just flat, right? Yeah. Droning on and on, the boring college professor it's very hard for people to stay focused on that. It's the same concept as an in-person presentation where the most animated speakers are the people that are going to drive attention. And you almost need to dial that up 2 clicks. You can't tell everyone to do this, of course, but you almost need to drive that up 2 clicks when you're recorded doing something like this, because that's what's going to, your natural energy is going to convey to people, oh, this is exciting, I should pay attention. Yes. As opposed to, and the CMS ruling, blah, blah, blah. It's just easy to tune out. Let me check my email over here.
I think it's such a good point, because I think as a moderator, your job is to make it entertaining and make it engaging. And somebody said to me the other day, it said, you've got to think about presentations, and I think this applies very much to webinars and to panels in particular, is you've got to make it, you've got to assume you lose people's attention after 5 minutes. And so you've got to think about it in 5-minute increments. Yeah. And so when I've done a lot of moderating panels, and what I try to do is a couple of things. First of all, get banter going. So prepare people. I'm going to throw these 2 questions to you, and I want you guys. And this is in the preparation, and I want you guys to have a discussion about it. Don't just agree with each other, and also be prepared as the moderator to disagree and to provoke. I think the worst panels are the ones where everybody's prepared, they've got their stock answers, and what it does is it becomes like going down the 4 panelists. Same thing, same sequence. What do you think about the answer to this question? it's like watching paint dry.
Yeah, especially.
I watch chat show. I watch some of the best chat show people and see how they actually try to get what it takes to get a good interview. There's a real art to it, and I certainly haven't mastered it.
Absolutely, especially when people are really trained in their talking points. So my favorite participants or panel members are people that are less polished, because they're honestly, they're more off the cuff. I feel like it's more raw, and that is more engaging. Now, that's not to say that like polished answers aren't good answers. They absolutely can be. But again, it can come off as stale. So that's one of the things.
Authentic. Yeah.
Yeah. That's one of the things that needs to be balanced. And then on a related token, as far as, let's say, even you're doing like a single SME webinar on something, on some topic. So then it gets a little bit harder, right, to build that energy level, because it's artificial. You probably know each other, or maybe you don't if you're hosting third party. It's, again, there's going to be some nerves. You're talking to a computer screen. It's like strange, but one of the things then that can get audience engagement going is to plan and get used to using those interactive like quiz tools. Again, it's one of those things that seems a little, do I really have to do this? No, you don't have to do it. But it does help people stay focused and force them to tune in, especially when you do like live panels, live polls, because people want to know what other people there are experiencing and thinking too. So it's not just about having preceded questions, which is another tip. When you get to your live Q&A, it's always going to be crickets at first. So have some well-planted 2 or 3 FAQs from your sales team to start that are fake audience questions. And sometimes you'll need them. Usually you won't, if it's a good webinar, especially. But that type of thing, the interactive elements of some of the better webinar tools, those types of things will really help drive engagement and keep it interesting. And then I guess it depends on the culture of the product or the business or the company too. But I always love with webinars and educational topics, especially in tech, which can be B2 boring, right? Is if they throw a meme in somewhere, I think everyone appreciates it, especially if it's topical. So
great. All right. So let's talk about promoting it. So how do you make sure people show up, or at least register, right?
Yes, this is a little bit of the mechanics as well. Most tools will generate a quick landing page or a quick form for you to use to get people into the webinar. If you're going to take it to the next level in professionalism, then you need a dedicated integrated landing page. So this means you're integrating that form into a branded landing page that just looks really nice. There's plenty of templates out there. If you have a web team, I'm sure they can build something for you. So that's the first one. And then, as we talked about earlier, early, often, and last minute email marketing. So when I would run email marketing, you'd use your automation tools, or hopefully you have them available, where you're blasting your list. And then you have an active list where if they register and they're on this list, and they're not going to keep getting the, hey, sign up for webinar emails, but there are reminder emails and that kind of thing. That kind of logic goes into it. I'm going to hammer in those last minute, day before, day of. I send day before and day of ones, because again, if they've registered, they're not getting both emails, because they crush it. Like, absolutely do it if you can get approval. Engage the SDRs.
Just one point there, which is this may not be something that everybody thinks about, but it seems obvious, but it is a very important thing, which is a suppression thing, which is if somebody's registered, don't take them off the list. Put it into your CM, your marketing automation system, that they don't get the additional emails. Otherwise, they'll just get annoyed and not show up. And they may block you. It's really important.
Yeah, exactly. Of course, then they should have a reminder sequence. But yes, definitely.
Reminder sequences. That's the other thing. Yeah.
As I said earlier, engage the SDRs and BDRs and remind them to talk to their prospects to drive registrations that way. If you can, get a banner on your company website. If you can, get a banner or text promotion to add to the bottom of email signatures running about a month ahead of time. That usually works really well, especially with the sales team. Social media, of course, amplification, boosted and promoted posts.
I should make a point on social media. One trick that I've been doing is LinkedIn has LinkedIn events. Mm-hmm. I'm not talking about LinkedIn Live, which is a whole other thing, but LinkedIn events. So you can basically promote a LinkedIn event to your entire network. And it's really easy. The barrier to registration is much, much lower. So I find you get a lot more registrants. The problem is that there's like a soft registrant. So you then have to do follow up with them to get them to do a hard registration.
Yeah. No, that's a great addition.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's fabulous. I would absolutely add that in. And if you can get your executives, if they have a following and a presence there to do, that'll absolutely help as well.
Yeah.
So yeah, we're talking about social media, boosted and promoted posts. One thing that you can also do, depending on the tool you're using, is upload the presentation deck and any handouts to the platform ahead of time.
That's counterintuitive, really.
Yeah. So one of the reasons for this is that it's one of those check off the box items. The live attendees really appreciate the ability to download the deck for whatever reason. I don't know if it's just they feel more engaged instead of just watching it, but that, and if you have any one-pagers, the one-pagers are going to get less attention unless it's a case study or something like that. But the deck, especially the presentation, is always a high value object. And then if you're doing something where you're giving best practices or whatever, for example, we could do it with this, where if we want to take a one-pager and make it a download or a handout, or they have their takeaways from the webinar, that's something people appreciate. And it also is a way to extend your branding and your brand recognition and awareness and your presence in their life after the webinar. And I know there's some split-mindedness on this as far as should we give them the presentation deck or not, especially if they didn't come live. If they didn't come and attend live, like I said, there's people that are interested in your webinar but just can't make the time work.
Yep.
So I always, in my automated follow-up emails, would include a link to both the webinar and the slides, because I learned over time that if I only sent out a link to the replay, then people that were interested would ask me for the slides anyway. So then it just became a preemptive thing, because it's another way to keep a little bit of a digital tab on how interested people are. And I'll be honest, I was always surprised by the number of people that wouldn't show up live that would still absolutely follow up on a replay, because my personal bias is that like replays are boring. I don't want to watch a replay. But one thing as marketers we have to always remember is that other people aren't us. So we have to try to remove our personal biases from things. And lastly, promoting webinar, if you want more live attendees, do a giveaway. People love giveaways. Yeah, I know, it's funny, right? But it seems like a little cheesy, but when you think about it, how often in our lives, especially in the professional sector, do we really win anything? Like anything. So it sounds gimmicky, right? Like a $50 gift card. Like it's really, $50 is that big of a deal. To some people it might be, absolutely. But especially if you're targeting tech people in B2B, right? It's $50. It's not necessarily $50. It's the feeling of winning something, right? Yeah. And so what you do when you're promoting this is you have to be present to win, attend live to win. It gives them just a little bit of a carrot to actually do it. And then you
there, right? Yeah.
Yes, exactly. A dopamine hit. And then they get to go home, tell the family, feel good, tell the colleagues, whatever. But it's just a nice little way to add some additional magic or whatever to your webinar. And then run the actual raffle. There's a couple of free programs out there where hopefully if you do have a moderator or an assistant, they can take the live attendee list, throw it into one of those like randomizers and actually select the winner from that and do that at the very end of the webinar.
I think we're using StreamYard here, and I think you showed we were playing around with it. I think you showed you can actually do that. You can. That's a feature they actually have built into this, right?
Yeah, I think so. Yep, I think StreamYard does have it.
Pretty neat.
Yep. All right. Transitioning to during the webinar now. So as I mentioned, we're just talking about the moderator role. Ideally, you have a moderator and the moderator is doing the introductions, the housekeeping like you did earlier today. Sometimes that might be just context setting. Sometimes it might be how to use the controls on your screen, right? Because there's so many webinar platforms. It's always worthwhile if you can to show them how to ask a question, how to raise their hand, how muting and unmuting is going to work, right? That type of thing. It just always helps people. You also need a chat monitor and someone who can hopefully help as tech support, right? Because you're always going to have someone who's, my audio isn't working. So that's another thing when you're choosing your platforms, especially in healthcare, they might be, if they're at work, they might not actually have computer speakers and they might not be on a modern laptop, right? That's part of the challenge with healthcare and why health tech is such a big industry is that trying to get the dinosaur to come into the modern age. So that's something to consider. And always provide a dial-in line if you can. That will always help. And then remind people of it in the live chat. If you're a speaker, have fun. I know everyone has different personalities, but again, the best webinars, the best presentations are if people are just okay with having fun with what they're talking about, right? If you can get the camaraderie between the speakers, if you can make it entertaining. 67% of attendees rate speaker passion and enthusiasm as the most important factor. This is even over content and topics. But because again, it goes back to people wanting to be entertained. I like to start webinars or presentations with an interactive event after the housekeeping, right? Just to kind of set the tone that this is not a one-way conversation. Even if it is a larger webinar and you're not going to be opening up phone lines or anything like that, having them know that they're going to be able to interact on the screen all of a sudden gets them to pay attention a little bit more, because people are still fairly used to signing up for webinar and you sit and you're talked at and you're talked at and you're talked at and you're not expected to do anything. So it's a nice gap from what's usual. I talked about ending the webinar with a raffle. And then one of the other best practices is to close the webinar with a 5-question attendee survey, if you can.
Yeah. During the webinar or was that afterwards?
So depending on the platform, you can have these quick surveys pop up immediately after the webinar is ended. And then you can also obviously send it out in the follow-up emails to the live attendees. And I wouldn't bother with the people that don't attend live. Yeah. But what you want to, so there's a few things you're trying to accomplish with the survey, right? Which is one, first of all, how did they like the webinar?
You do, right? Yeah.
Yeah. How did you do? But also from a content perspective, how useful was it? Did you hit the right balance between education and also driving awareness to your brand and product? Of course, you're always going to have people that are like, this was a sales pitch, even if you only gave it like a minute of airtime in a 60-minute presentation, right? And then the other thing is you want to give them a chance to raise their hand. We always include a question that would say, would you like someone to contact you to discuss our solutions one-to-one? And that's where you start to get that, I think, what was it, like 2 to 5% conversion or whatever the stat was up front.
Very good. Yeah, I like I did a series of webinars on ABM a couple of years ago with HIMS, and we were doing them every 2 weeks. And they did these surveys, and I found them incredibly helpful, because I literally I'd take the comments and I would fine tune the next presentation accordingly. It's valuable in many different ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the last part we talked about before and during, and the last part of the webinar is really after the webinar, right? So it's not over when it's over. Your marketing team, you're going to want to make sure you have the automated email set up. So thank you for attending. Sorry we missed you. Here's the replay video. I like to set it up for about 2 hours after the live event. And as I said earlier, include the survey. And then you can decide how you want to approach BDR outreach and appointment setting. Of course, they're going to want to prioritize and reach out immediately to anyone that said that they wanted to be contacted. Outside of that, there is a choice, right, for your outbound callers to call the list, especially live attendees, and just start a conversation. Hey, I saw you attended our webinar. Did you have any questions that we weren't able to answer for you? Or just to basically, again, add that human element and that customer service, that one-to-one touch point, so that it doesn't seem like business selling to business without human in between. Typically, again, because there's been an interaction, even if they didn't raise their hand, if there happens to be any questions swirling in the back of their head, sometimes that additional outreach will just open the door just a little bit more. And ultimately, that's what the game's all about. That can be really helpful. Q&A follow-up. This is the big one. So whenever we did webinars, especially when you start to get the type of numbers that I was talking about earlier, you are going to run out of time with the questions, right? And that's a balance. Whenever you're scheduling a webinar, you want to leave time for Q&A. But what you don't want, and everyone's probably been here at some point, is you get to the Q&A and you're like, okay, it seems like that's all the questions we have for today. There's a little bit of awkward, like, okay, bye. But once you're in your groove, you are, and especially topic dependent, you're not going to be able to answer all the questions. So in that case, if someone answered a live question during the webinar, I, on the marketing side, super prioritize triaging any question that wasn't answered with an SME to answer that question and engage with that prospect. So that's not necessarily a sales thing because they might not have that level of knowledge depth. But if you've got someone that was trying to engage that way, don't leave it until a week later to reach out to them. You can, but it's not the best experience for them. So I always prioritize that. Next up, as we talked about, repurpose the content or start to think about that part as well. This can be an easy one, especially bandwidth wise, to let slide, but there's so many AI tools now where you can get transcription and you can pull out maybe topics that came out. Think about, would any of this make a blog? Maybe you've got several short blogs from that. It really depends what the content was as far as how to repurpose. The basic one I think most people do is obviously make it available. And then you get into the, well, should I gate or should I not gate conversation? And that's a whole other tech talk, so to speak, but you definitely want to have that as well. It's a big asset that you've created. A lot of planning that went into it to definitely get as much mileage as possible. And then, of course, we want to track attribution to measure ROI. So this is not just net new leads or opportunities or people that raise their hand to talk to sales. It's opportunity creation and funnel impact overall. So with webinars, one of the things that I did in my seat every quarter was look at every deal that closed, and we looked at a few different attribution points from a marketing side. Sometimes it was sales, but we looked at two things. What got them into our universe, if you will? It's an event. So it might not be a webinar. Maybe it's a trade show that perhaps you signed up at and you got their email there, or they were part of an email list that you bought or something to that effect. How did they come in B2B? Maybe it was an inbound lead. That would be wild, right? Those happen as well. There's how did they come into our universe? And then there's what moved them over into actually an active deal state. So the interesting thing that I learned here and looking at data over a couple of years is that webinars were a very big tool for that, moving them into an active deal status. So this is where it becomes, this is where it becomes a big lead nurture thing, because you can be hitting you're growing your email list. You can be hitting your email list. Your BDRs could be leaving messages. If you're consistently running webinars, sooner or later, it's going to be the right time for them. And it's an easy entry point for them to come in and start to be active again. And so from there, then if you are having your BDRs do follow up, it can be a way to actually turn that lead into an active deal and in your pipeline. So there's a couple things, obviously, and I think this is why earlier at the top of this talk, there's that stat of a lifetime, what will become potentially a customer. It's because of this. It's because you can have the submarine leads and what have you that kind of disappear. And then all of a sudden they're on a webinar and they have questions. There's been some internal trigger that happened, or maybe some higher priority projects are now off the table. So webinars can be a really easy way for them to start to re-engage, because not everyone's ready to re-engage with a sales rep or be pitched to, right? So it's a nice reminder, what did that company do again? And what are we talking about?
It's all about making it easy for buyers to self-serve. And at least that way, because if you're gating the recording, you've then got some way of seeing who's actually watching it. Or if you're using some of that HubSpot and you can track a previous registrant, it's coming back to it, then you can start to see who's actually in market.
Yeah,
so
that's a great point for recorded webinars. I was leaning towards when you have a webinar cadence, because the newer ones are always going to do a little bit better, of course. The other thing, as far as attribution to keep a lens on, is that sometimes it'll be because your outbound callers, your BDRs, mention the webinar, they attend the webinar, and now they really start to engage. So sometimes then you'll have, it was because sales did outreach, but was it really? It was, but it was because of the content marketing put together. And that's attribution, which is a whole other tech talk as well. So just something to keep in mind there.
So Hannah, I can't thank you enough. You've really gone into this in a lot of detail. It's chock full of insight, chock full of data, your own personal experience. But so I love the granularity of this. For anybody watching the presentation or listening, the presentation is accessible below. We're going to do some sort of checklist to follow up with this as well, because there's a lot in here. And I just think that if you follow 50% of what Hannah said, you're going to improve the way that you use webinars, and they are effective. So Hannah, thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it. A lot of thought went into it. Okay, so we're going to wrap this one up. If you're watching this on YouTube, you can subscribe. If you're listening to the podcast, maybe just listening to this first time, you can subscribe to this on Spotify, on Apple, whatever your favorite podcast is. And we're going to have lots more of this Health Tech Marketing Show. Our plan is to do this at least every couple of weeks. I may take a little bit of a break over Christmas, as you can see by our backgrounds if you're watching on YouTube. We've got, it's very festive. We're obviously wishing you happy holidays. And if you've got any thoughts or any ideas on episodes, on things that you think would make a good show, just let me know. Email me at adam@healthlaunchpad.com or DM me through LinkedIn. You can find me there quite easily. I'm the only Adam Chirinas. So Hannah, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Want to say goodbye?
Yeah, thanks everyone. Happy holidays, and thanks for listening or watching.
Excellent. Bye all.